Okay, so in this short lesson, we're going to go over disaster recovery and business continuity. So it's going to be important that in this session we can't do anything practical. I'm not going to start advertising that we can start wiping systems out, but feel free to do that in your own time if you have indispensable amount of money, but I do not. Okay, so I'm looking at disaster recovery and defining it. The best sort of definition I can come up with is it's a planned response or process that allows a business operation to continue as normal. So at this point, a good decision to make would be what is a business operation that's critical to our organisation. So if it's an e-commerce company, then their web server and sort of web platforms are going to be essential for them to maintain their business to continue as normal, or they're not going to be getting any money in. If it's a bank, the banking services will need to be prioritised as a critical operation. So this is an important step. A lot of organisations will look at off-the-shelf disaster recovery documents just because they have to, and it's not a one-size-fits-all model. There has to be a process or a plan in place that identifies all your critical operations and prioritises them in the case of a disaster. Okay, so why do we have disaster recovery plans? Well, hardware fails. Storage devices fail, power supplies fail, etc. Full machines fail. Users are dangerous, so people that come into your organisation, your own employers or employees, can bring in USB pens with viruses on. They can click on links that send malware across a network, etc. You can have power outages, so that's quite common that a full building will be without power for X amount of time. We've just come out of probably the biggest disaster, certainly in my lifetime, is the COVID-19 pandemic, where business had to change from office-based to home-based, and how businesses cope with that was different up and down all over the world. Data loss is quite common, and things like fires and floods can happen as well in businesses. Okay, so what's involved in a disaster recovery plan? Well, you've got to identify the likelihood of a risk. So it is unlikely we will have another global pandemic. Okay, it is probably likely there could be a fire, theft, flood at an organisation. And what will be done in each event to minimise disruption. So once you've identified the likelihood of that risk, you've got to produce a plan to either mitigate that risk, or when something does happen, what are you going to do to get things back up and running? And that will be decided by someone who's a responsible person. So that's normally an IT manager or a chief technical officer. They will trigger the disaster recovery plan, and people within that plan will know their roles. The plan should be tested, so throughout the year, 3 or 4 times, your disaster recovery strategy should be tested. Or if it's not, then clearly, when a disaster does strike, then people won't be ready, and you won't know where there's areas that can be improved, or areas that are just not fit for purpose. And it's also about identifying single points of failure. So realistically, as a rule within IT, you need sort of two of everything as a minimum, and sort of reducing them single points where possible. Okay, within sort of disaster recovery strategy, organisations could have contractual obligations. So if it's a data loss or a data breach, then in Europe, by GDPR regulations, that we have a duty to tell our customers within sort of 72 hours that we have had that breach. So that would be specified in the disaster recovery plan. If we're an IT support agency and we can't provide that support, we would need to let our customers know that unfortunately during these hours that we cannot produce the support that we're actually contracted to do. So that's why these sort of legalities and why a disaster recovery plan needs to include these specifications or specified items. to make sure we're prepared, or the organisation's prepared in that eventuality. Okay, so going into data integrity, the most common thing within a disaster recovery plan is the data. Okay, so where are backups stored, and how are they restored is quite a popular thing that goes missed, because people focus so much on the backup and not the recovery, because during that recovery time the systems aren't working. And I'll go into that in a short space when we talk about backup strategies. But sort of making sure that data is integral and the data is the same as what it was before the disaster is really, really important. Just thought of an example where you may have a company that's had a cyber attack, and there's viruses, etc., malware across a system, and you need to verify that the data is the same when it's restored after that sort of violation to where it was, what it was previously. Okay, and then backups would be stored from a strategy of either full backup, differential backup, or incremental backup. So with sort of time backups, where you're backing up certain amounts from, say, you back up, run a backup on Wednesday that's just the data that's changed since Tuesday, and then you run a backup on Thursday that's the data changed since Wednesday, etc. That's a backup strategy, and where that disaster hits will determine whether or not that data is integral. So we maintain that integrity of data, because again, going back to the speed of recovery, not always a good strategy would be to have full backups all the time, because if you're running full backups daily, A, it's going to take up a lot of storage space, but B, when a disaster strikes, it's going to take a long time to get that data back up and running. So again, organisations might just back up fully critical operations and leave non-critical operations to sort of a weekly backup, etc. Okay, then sort of the final piece is about redundancy. So commonly in large organisations, they have multiple sites, and whether that's a hot site or a cold site. So a hot site would replicate data live. So in the event of a disaster, you can simply move your operations to that site, and everything's just running as normal, because the data has been replicated live to that site. If it's a cold site, the site is available, but the data is not replicated there, or it's replicated in partial form. So in that case, it will take more time to get that site back up and running. So I'm thinking in terms of like a fire or a power outage. If you went to a cold site, you would need to trigger your recovery process to get back up and running. Whereas if you went to a hot site, you just simply move your workforce from A to B and everything's just as normal. Okay. Working from home was a big sort of lesson for a lot of organisations on where data is, and sort of that shift to cloud applications has become massively popular to allow people to access their data or the company's data securely from anywhere at any time. So that can be embedded into a disaster recovery plan. Okay, so that's disaster recovery in a nutshell. Key things are that this isn't an off-the-shelf, something you can find on the internet and just use that. It has to be specific to an organisation and an organisation's critical processes. Business continuity is the key to this whole process. So any organisation you can look at and use an example. For example, an ice cream van can't run without the refrigerators working. So that is their critical operation. That's a non-IT example, but you can use something similar